Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming out on this cold, grey February evening. Perhaps cold, grey February is a tautology. But we'll see if we can warm you up with some economic theory, if that is. Is that possible? I'm not sure. Last time we were trying to understand why policy started to concern itself with aggregate outcomes. Why was it that monetary policy moved away from just setting standards, values of money, to perhaps thinking about worlds in which it could try to offset bad outcomes, like high levels of unemployment or recessions? And this newfound responsibility was something that was felt had to be exercised after World War II. People had come back from the war, a sense in which we'd signed up for a full employment agenda after the Beveridge Report and the Full Employment Report of 1944. And there was a need perhaps to think about how stabilisation policy, in particular monetary policy, would operate in real time to try and bring the economy back to its full employment level under stable prices. So what had been perhaps the golden fetters of the gold standard now became a question in terms of how do we actually use policy? When do we move interest rates? In response to what factors? What impact will a change of interest rates have on the economy? Today you would have noted that the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England maintained a bank rate at 0.5% for the 71st successive month. Of course, they haven't been sitting on their hands. During that time, they've also managed to buy £375 billion of UK bonds, but this is highly unusual. We've gone from a world in which the average duration of an interest rate was several months to a world in which we're almost certainly going to get 6 years and more of interest rates at the same level. And so at the end of this lecture, we'll try to understand why it might be that even if monetary policymakers have a responsibility to stabilise the economy, it may be better, and we may all agree it's better for them to do nothing from time to time. And we'll try to understand how we ended up there. The immediate post-war period, we know, was one in which we can think about a world of very large public debts following the war. The debt to GDP level was in excess of 200%, even larger, may I say, than Greece's. Rather than having the implicit fixed exchange rate of the gold standard, we had joined the Bretton Woods system of fixed but adjustable exchange rates, which gave us some ability to change the external value of the currency, which was exercised on a number of occasions. There were capital controls, and there was financial repression. It was quite a difficult climate to think about the design of policy. If we put those issues to one side, it was quickly learnt that policy was going to be undertaken under extreme uncertainty, by which I mean the data. As we learnt last time, the first set of national accounts in the UK were not presented until 1941. So we didn't know that much about the past, but over time in the 40s and 50s we slowly managed to learn about the state of the economy. But we'll all know that we tend to find out about the economy with lags. We don't know in real time what's happening. What parameters? How will the economy respond to changes in monetary or fiscal policy? If we have very short runs of data, how do we know exactly what the response will be? We're guessing, or learning, or making mistakes. This is what we mean by uncertainty. And what we found, I think, in the 50s and 60s, that what looked like a relatively simple control problem turned into something that was incredibly subtle and complex. And I think ultimately led to a rather large scaling down in the ambition of policy. Rather than being able to bring about full employment and low inflation all the time by continual and perhaps excessive use of the levers of stabilisation policy, perhaps it was felt by the end of this long period we should do less and not try to claim that we can achieve things that we can't. But let me sort of go through that story over time. As we thought more about monetary policy in the 50s, a number of questions would suggest themselves. How can it be that one interest rate or one choice on the level of the deficit can necessarily set a given level of output? Surely the choice of large amounts of private agents would also matter. So many people's institutions making operations. How can we add them up and think about one stream of interest rates to stabilize that economy? We think about that. We think about how difficult the problem is. How do we deal with the various institutions? We've got a Treasury, a Bank of England. In the post-war period, we're going to worry about unions, industrialists, and the financial sector, as I said earlier, which is suffering or has some form of financial repression imposed upon it. How are we going to control these actors to bring about the outcomes that we want? How are we going to explain our actions? How are we going to persuade them that our objectives are fair and just? And how are we going to get them to agree with our objectives and our responses in such a manner that it becomes easier for us to achieve them? These are the difficult questions and the dialogues that policymakers had to learn in this period that previously perhaps they did not have to do to the same degree. And this is where people like me would come in. What theory do we have to guide us if we're policymakers? When we think about reaching full employment, how should we respond to shocks? How should we respond to movements in the economy over time? I've already mentioned this, but it's worth mentioning again. Remember, the way we measure, sample, and understand the evolution of the economy is not completely discrete. It's not as though on a certain day we then know what happened on every part of the economy over the period 4 or 5 years. It's continually changing. There are revisions, there are bits of data, surveys, industrial production numbers, changes in the exchange rate, changes in share prices, all of which may move in a noisy manner, for which the policymaker has the difficult problem of trying to extract the signal from all those noisy bits of information. How do they add them up in real time? How do they form a judgment about the state of the economy and the likely response of the economy to the impulses imparted by changes in monetary policy choices? These are the questions that became clear in the post-war period. And of course, metaphors abounded. Economists, we love metaphors. We're driving the economy. We're looking in the rearview mirror. We've got brakes. We've got accelerators. We're trying to get to our destination. We're piloting a ship. We're trying to avoid the icebergs, knowing that when we, I don't know, how do you slow down a ship, whatever. When we turn off the engine, it's still going to continue going forward for some time, and you can't turn it very easily port or starboard. Gosh, I remember that. Yes, one way or the other. So we have these metaphors that we use all the time. And of course, they're all metaphors for the lags. The lags in evaluation, the lags in action, thinking time, and the lags in the response of the economy to our choices. These make the problems very, very difficult for the policymaker. And what the policymaker wants to do is hit what is perhaps unfortunately, but rather clearly called the bliss point, as economists think about it. And the bliss point we'll come to in a minute with a graph to warm you up and excite you, is one in which we reach some target of low inflation and some stable output level or full employment level. That's what we're going to think about the bliss point. And there, we're going to be happy, and if we're a politician, we're going to get re-elected, or for a central banker, we're not going to get shouted at when we walk down the street. That's the kind of situation we want to get into as a policymaker. So, let's think about how we're going to control our economy. Forgive me, I'll just... take a bit of water. A.W. Phillips, economist, engineer economist, a Kiwi, suggested there was a trade-off, between unemployment and inflationary pressure. And what he was able to do, with a long UK data set, helped from colleagues at the LSE, Phelps Brown and Sheila Hopkins, examined the relationship between wage pressure and unemployment in a 50-year period, 1861 to 1913, noticed there was a negative relationship, so that when unemployment fell, wage pressure started to rise, or when unemployment increased, wage pressure would start to fall. So these ideas should seem intuitive to us now, but it was very interesting that he found this relationship. To the extent that we can think of economics being a set of a kind of predictive science, we're not predicting necessarily what the unemployment will be, because that depends upon a large number of factors. But the predictive element is then to say, well, if we have this relationship in the period 1861 to 1913, do we see the same relationship out of sample? So if I look at samples from 1913 to 1948, and again from 1948 to 1957, do I see the same negative relationship? So in that sense, it's predictive. And he did find that the same relationship existed. And indeed, other economists in the US, Paul Samuelson, Robert Solow and others, found similar relationships in the US. And this seemed to suggest there was a possibility of having a menu of choices between a level of inflation and output. If we were concerned that inflation was too high, we could possibly act on output, produce some spare capacity, and that may lead to some downward inflationary pressure. Maybe it would give us some idea about how we may be able to control our economy and some understanding of the constraints which may apply. His relationship that he plotted was non-linear, so that means that very low unemployment rates, inflationary pressure will rise very quickly, and at very low inflation rates, we may find unemployment rising very quickly. So this non-linear thing was something to bear in mind. But most economists now tend to use a linear version, so we can think about that, a world in which we're not far from our bliss point. And what we want to try and do is pick a point that we're going to be happy with. So we can think of a world in which the post-war consensus for unemployment was around 3%, and we want some notion, perhaps, that if we can get to this kind of point with 3% unemployment and, say, 1% inflation, we're going to be around our bliss point, and we can make the arithmetic of it easier. We don't worry so much about the non-linearity. We say, well, this economy is going to be fairly close to its equilibrium, so we'll concentrate on a linear version of it. And by using a linear version in which we don't move that far away from the equilibrium, our errors are not too large. If we use a linear version in the extremes, then we're going to have very large errors in our approximation. But we'll assume that's not going to happen. So the economists, when they started thinking about this, say, look, we'll think about the steady state, and we'll think about small changes around it, and we'll think about how we can use this as a way to think about policy making. So the nonlinear line I've just that Phillips plotted, we can linearize in this form, and you can see that it's suggesting there's a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. In a sense, the theory was saying this is the constraint, or these are the set of options available to policymakers. The economy has to lie somewhere on that line, is the argument. Now, of course, it doesn't strictly lie on that line. There's perturbations around it. But in general terms, we can expect it to lie fairly close to that line. That's the way we start to think about it. So now we can compare that to our bliss point. And our bliss point, as I said, is some notion of unemployment, say, at around 3%, and perhaps inflation of 1 or 2%, whatever takes your fancy. And this is our point at which we're happiest. And I've drawn concentric circles around because anywhere on any of these concentric circles, we're equally happy, and the same loss or the same level of relative unhappiness compared to that bliss point. Because clearly, anywhere on that circle, you're the same distance from that bliss point. So you can imagine having, compared to that bliss point here, slightly less unemployment compared to target. That might be inflationary in the future, so you still prefer that bliss point, but you're indifferent between that point here, which is slightly less unemployment, which may be inflationary in the future, and that point here, which is slightly more unemployment that might be deflationary in the future. And similarly for inflation. Slightly higher inflation or slightly lower inflation are both away from your bliss point, so you're indifferent between the two. So think of a world in which that's where you'd ideally want to be, but if you can't get there, you want to get to the indifference curve or concentric circle, which is closest to the bliss point. And that's where your economy is going to aim for. And in this world, it's going to be that green blob there. So what we have is a theory of policy that's developing. The theory of policy is developing in terms of this is the constraint the economy observes. This is where we'd ultimately like to be, But social preferences mean that we care about inflation deviating from target and unemployment deviating from full employment in equal measure. So the best we can do is probably get to that green blob there. And that's kind of what we were thinking about in terms of post-war policy immediately when we were able to start moving policy in the way we wanted to. But what we then found was the static Phillips curve that I've just outlined, which is a within-period relationship between inflation and unemployment, didn't look terribly stable. So if we just, for a second, if I'm allowed to go back, when we tried to get continuity to this menu, we found that this relationship either moved or wasn't quite what Phillips said it was. And so we can see we have a whole range of different attempts of Phillips curves. In fact, it's quite possible to write the story of monetary policy making in the post-war as stories of different Phillips curves. And one thing we should think about Phillips curves is they're really a metaphor. They're a metaphor for the structure of the economy. How does the economy respond to cost shocks? What does that do to unemployment? How does the economy respond to demand shocks? What does that do to inflation? The Phillips curve is a metaphor for all those key relationships in an economy. And so we started with this static Phillips curve, which is essentially a within-period relationship between the two. And then what we discovered was that rather than a relationship between unemployment and inflation, it was perhaps better to rewrite that as a relationship between output and inflation, and actually not inflation, but the change in inflation. So now, if output increased above its natural level or full employment level, that would lead to an acceleration in inflation. And inflation would accelerate to some new higher level until output went back to its trend level. So there was no relationship, according to the accelerationist Phillips curve, between output and inflation, but only between output and the change in inflation. So that's one innovation in Phillips curve theory. We then moved on, helped by Milton Friedman, to think about the expectations augmented Phillips curve, which is, we're going to end up in the world of some horrible phrases here. And economists, I'm sorry, we seem to come up with some quite appalling damage to the English language, but anyway, we have to live with it. This was mostly before I was born, so I can't take any blame for this whatsoever. Expectations augmented Phillips curve. So in this world, output is not responding to inflation, but it's actually responding to expected inflation in an adaptive manner. So output might respond to inflation, but once output incorporates expected inflation into its planning, think of what firms may do, you're going to find this curve shifting. And I'll show you that in an example shortly, just to press that point home. We then had another abuse of the English language as NERU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So there's some level of unemployment for which the inflation rate will not change. That's all that's saying. Think of that as a natural rate of unemployment, if you will. In any economy, at any moment in time, some people will be searching for a job, some people will be between jobs. People need that search time, so we can expect there to be 3 to 5% of people unemployed at any particular moment in time. And that can still correspond to a notion of full employment. It doesn't have to be zero. Probably our best guess today is around 5%. We then moved on to a Lucas surprise Phillips curve. So now we had a story that only unexpected inflation shocks impact on output or labour supply. So we formed labour contracts to give us a certain amount of wages, only if inflation was different to that which we expected when we contracted for our wage rate or the value of output we would supply, would output change if inflation turned out to be something different. So imagine a world in which we've contracted a wage increase of 2%. If inflation turns out to be 4%, our real wages have fallen, firms will buy more labour, and that will lead to a temporary increase in output as more people are taken on as real wages have fallen. But that's only temporary. In the next period, wages will change to 4% rather than 2% growth. That's the Lucas supply. And most recently, in the last 10 years or so, we've used to policymakers thinking in terms of a new Keynesian Phillips curve, in which inflation is actually a function of the future. our expectations of the future. How strongly do we think the economy is growing in the future? If we think it's growing fast in the future, inflation will rise today. We then get into the world of preemptive strikes. And as this is not a lecture on foreign policy, I won't make the obvious analogy. But of course you can make a preemptive strike in monetary policy and say that you cured a shock, but no one may have seen it come along in the first place. It gets very hard to understand monetary policy in that context. So, let me sort of just shock you with some colour, but it's fairly easy from what we've already done. We've already examined the bliss point, we've already examined our points of indifference, and we've already examined the original Phillips curve. So what I'm saying here is, let us suppose we've chosen a higher level of inflation up to here, and according to this Phillips curve relationship, unemployment will fall. But once wage contracts start to expect this level of inflation, unemployment will drift back to this point A. It will increase again to point A, but will incorporate this higher level of inflation. That will then mean this original Phillips curve will drift up to A. So what you're going to end up with is permanently higher inflation, but the same level of unemployment, whether it's the natural rate of unemployment or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment that you had before. And you can run the same trick if you wish. You can say to yourself, what I want is less unemployment. I've got an election coming. It's desperate. I get these marginal voters to vote for me, so I'm going to do something to decrease the level of unemployment. So I have another inflation shock. Inflation rises, but then people incorporate these into their plans, and we end up back at a point B. And you can see where we are. In a sense, the long-run Phillips curve could very well be vertical. No trade-off may exist. And we end up really expositing Milton Friedman's 1967 lecture to the American Economic Association, that there is no trade-off, essentially, between inflation and unemployment, which makes it difficult for policymakers. There's no trade-off. How are we going to affect policy? So we'll come back to this point later on. What I'm pointing out here are the difficulties that we discovered once we started to set policy. It's not as easy as we thought it was going to be. Do forgive me. Because we may have different views about the Phillips. I've outlined 5 or 6 different types of Phillips curves. As a policymaker, can you have your own private view about what the structure of the economy is? Or should you choose a view that minimises the chance of you making mistakes? Of course, you've got to think in those game theoretic terms. You've got to put your own views aside and make a choice that minimises the chance of error. And that's where we end up. And I want you to imagine 3 people. I want you to imagine a chap called Schulze, who believes in a forward-looking Phillips curve. So he thinks that inflation depends on expectations of future output alone. Let's suppose that's his belief. Let's suppose there's another chap called Chatelain, and he thinks that inflation depends on lagged output. So if inflation rises today, it's because we had a boom yesterday. Schulze thinks if inflation rises today, it's because we expect a boom in the future. So they may have these different, strong, independent views. And let's imagine, for the sake of argument, a theoretical third person who doesn't really exist called Clegg, right? So this guy, Clegg, is a bit of both. Believes that it may be forward-looking, it may be backward-looking, he really can't make up his mind. I'm sure there's no such person as Clegg like that out there, but let's suppose there was. How would we, or what should we do for a policymaker if we're in a committee that has Schulzes, Chatelains and Cleggs and we don't know the true structure of the economy? It's hard to estimate, it jumps around, there are stochastic shocks, the data is poor, the economy keeps changing. So let's do a thought experiment. Now, let's suppose Schulze has a belief of forward, and let's suppose the true Phillips curve, PC, not politically correct Phillips curve, is backward-looking. Okay? Now, if it's truly backward-looking, the person who is backward-looking will rank first in that system. The person who is forward-looking will do worst. The person who is a hybrid, who thinks it's a bit of both, will come somewhere between the two. Will end up with second rank in terms of outcomes of the economy. If the Phillips curve is truly forward-looking, the person who is backward-looking is going to rank third. the person who is forward-looking will rank first, and the person who is the hybrid will again come second. If the economy is truly hybrid, the person who is hybrid will come first, and the backward and forward-looking guys are both going to come second. So you can see where I'm going. A world in which we don't know what the true nature of it is, it's better to have a convex combination of possible views out there. And by having those, we're going to do least bad compared to the other two. So unfortunately, Clegg does rather well by sitting on the fence, annoying though it is. And we find this often in economics. A convex combination beats a royal flush. It's just a good idea sometimes, if we don't know, to have convex combinations of things in your head. Okay. So, where are we now going to go? We're now going to think more about what do we do in terms of instruments, preferences, and choice. So I'm going to outline a very influential set of work by two Dutch economists, Tinbergen-Thiel, for which Jan Tinbergen was a sharer in the first Nobel Prize in Economics 1969, that kind of sums up where we've got to so far in terms of the theory of monetary policy or stabilization policy more generally. And it's worth bearing these ideas in mind. We can summarize the theory of economic policy by saying the first thing we have to do is write down the preferences of the policymaker. And we have to assume the policymaker's preferences have been aligned with those of society. I was asked yesterday by someone saying, should the central bank set its own target? Should it be that independent? And I said, well, no, society must have a say over the central bank's target. But what we can ask of the central bank is to be operationally independent, to pursue the target given that it's housed by experts in the best way it can. But the target, in some sense, must reflect society's choices in a democracy. So that's what we want, in a sense. And the preferences I've already described to you may be defined in terms of inflation and output. Inflation is going to matter to us because we hold nominal contracts, and if we get the inflation rate wrong, we're going to end up with changes to our real consumption in a way that we may not like. And output matters for similar kinds of reasons, because we don't want there to be large variance in our ability to find work or the wage that we get from having had work. So in most people will have arguments that what matters in an economy is to have inflation at some stable level and output around the natural rate of growth, which is, in the UK, over the very long run, a fraction over 2%. So we define those preferences. Next thing we need to define is the structure of the economy. And one metaphor for the structure of the economy is the Phillips curve. It could be a short-run Phillips curve, which may exist in various forms that we've outlined, or it could be a long-run Phillips curve that implies no trade-off. But for policy purposes, let us assume there is some form of short-term trade-off, and let's just think about what that implies in terms of the policy choices available to a policymaker. Then the final part is you need a policy instrument. And the instrument could be interest rates, it could be the money supply, it could be fiscal policy. And you want the instrument to feed back from the state of the economy. So you want the instrument to respond. If the economy is growing too fast, the instrument responds to that by being active and dragging the economy back to its equilibrium. If the economy is growing too slowly, you want the instrument to respond to that and push the economy back to its equilibrium. That's what we mean by feedback parameters. And ideally, we'd want to get as close to the bliss point as we can. What we might want to do is solve these preferences, this structure, and these responses to get the optimal feedback for the economy. How fast should it feed back to output growth or inflation? We might be able to solve that if we believed in the parameters of the model. If we don't believe in the parameters because the economy changes too much or I can't adequately capture the structure, as I said in the lecture last time, we know that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And in a world in which we can't be sure about the model, maybe we shouldn't take the parameters of any model that we estimate too seriously, but what we might want to do is decide what kind of policies would produce the least bad outcomes, a little bit like Clegg was doing, at least for the Phillips curve, if not for other bits of the economy right now. And the final point, which is very important, is in the Tinbergen-Thiel framework, is that if we're going to get anywhere near to the bliss point, we're going to require as many independent instruments as targets. And this is the so-called Tinbergen counting principle. If we want to hit a single inflation target, we're going to need a single independent instrument, such as the interest rate. If we want to hit inflation and output targets, we're going to need two separate independent instruments. It could be monetary policy and fiscal policy to try and hit both. And then that throws open all kinds of questions as the extent that they are independent as instruments or the economy itself is independent. And let me illustrate with an example. Now, note I've rewritten unemployment now for output. It's a little bit easier to understand in the setting that I have here. The blue dot is still our bliss point, where we want to get to. We want to get re-elected, or as a central banker, we want to see out the whole of our contract. And let's suppose the economy, through shocks, is at this X marks the spot point, which is high inflation and high output growth. So it's some kind of boom. The economy's in a boom. Think Lawson boom, late 1980s, or the boom without an inflation that we suffered in the noughties. If we have two independent instruments, we can use one to bring down inflation, so we can get a movement from north to south. And if we have another independent instrument to act on output, we can move from east to west and get to our point here. And this is the essence of the counting. But it sounds obvious once you put it that way. But of course, in reality, the instruments may not be independent. The interest rates may impact on output. Fiscal policy may impact on interest rate or inflation. They may not be independent in the same way. And so what you may find in reality is, if you think of this as a Phillips curve rewritten in inflation output space, so here, when output is high, inflation is high, there's a positive relationship between the two. What we're going to do, the best we can do is get to this green blob here. The green blob here is preferred to the X because the X represents a lower level of utility or a higher level of losses, as both inflation and output at X are further away from the bliss point than they are at green. So the best we may be able to do is get to that green point there. But instruments themselves may be tricky. Instruments themselves may not work in the way that we want to. And one of the main reason here is that instruments themselves are subject to shocks. And this is analysis by Poole in the late 60s, published in 1970, is how do we decide which instrument to use when key economic relationships are not stable and subject to shocks? I will exposit this using the IS-LM framework we developed last time, but we can think about this problem of instrument choice in any area. We think about it as a surgeon or as a photographer, or anyone using any kind of instrument has the same kind of problem. But let me just do it with an example. We'll look at two ways of setting the instrument for monetary policy. We can set the interest rate, or we can set the money supply. And then we'll allow these curves to shift and see which one we'd prefer, which instrument delivers the best solution. That's the question we want to ask ourselves. And the way we're going to decide is we'll choose the instrument that induces the least variance in our target variable. That's our criterion. So for a surgeon, you're going to use the instrument that minimizes the death rate, presumably, or maximizes the recovery rate of the patient. That's the variance you're trying to minimize. In this sense, the instrument we're going to choose, which may be the money supply or the interest rate, the one we decide upon will be the one that induces the least variance in output. And I'll do it graphically, so we should be able to follow the result. The sad result is, what we'll discover is the actual result is going to be heavily parameter and shock dependent. So in general, you can't decide or know which instrument to use. It gets very difficult. So remember our IS-LM model from last time. We have a goods market relationship, so-called IS, and the money market relationship, the so-called LM equation. The IS equation is downward sloping. At lower interest rates, we're going to be able to bid for more goods. And the LM curve is upward sloping, because higher interest rates will choke off some of the speculative demand for money and allow it to be used for transactions instead. So we've got a money market equilibrium, the LM curve, and a goods market equilibrium, the IS curve. You don't particularly have to worry too much about whether you remember all of that, but we'll be able to see the results of two different types of policy rule. And we should be able to see that very clearly from the diagrams that we've set up here. So I want to imagine two worlds. One in which the money market interest rate is set. So whatever happens to the economy, the central bank has set R star. So whatever the level of expenditure is, Y, you will always have R star in place, a little bit like we currently have, interest rates at 0.5. The alternative is that the central bank could set the money stock at some level M star, and if there are changes in expenditure, interest rates could move to clear the goods market. So we're looking at two instruments here of monetary policy. One is setting the interest rate, and one is simply setting the money stock. And we're asking ourselves, which one should we choose? So in order to decide which one we're going to choose, we're going to imagine the expenditure profile is subject to stochastic shocks. Sometimes it's going to be a little bit high, sometimes it's going to be a little bit low. The highest it can get to is this dotted line, the lowest it can get to is this dotted line. And what we want to understand is, as a result of the two different policies we've implemented, which instrument will we choose? Well, it becomes very easy. In this world, if we set the interest rate, the expenditure shock here has its full impact, because part of it doesn't get choked off by higher interest rates. So the output increases all the way out to here from an expenditure shock if the interest rate is fixed. On the other hand, from a negative expenditure shock, because interest rates aren't allowed to fall, output falls all the way down to here. So the variance of output, YR, is very wide if expenditure shocks dominate and we set the interest rate. On the other hand, if these expenditure shocks come along and we allow interest rates to rise, some of the extra expenditure will be choked off, and the economy will perturbate only between YM and YM. For this highly specialized example, it looks like allowing interest rates to change is a better solution for this economy than having a fixed interest rate. So what's the problem? Why don't we just do that? I've just shown you it dominates, right? And for this next diagram, you may just want to close your eyes for a second before you open them again to look at them. It's, oh, it doesn't look too bad. I thought it was going to look terrible. I reduced some lines. So now, here's my problem. What if there are also shocks to money demand? I've set the money stock, but if there are shocks to money demand as well, you can see that in both cases, they're going to produce the same amount of variance in output. Makes it very hard. Policymaker, unless they know which shocks are going to dominate and what the slope of these relative lines is, cannot know which instrument to use. They just don't know what the impact is going to be on output, unless they have a very good and certain model of the economy and a certain model of the shocks. Of course, my argument to you in general is you don't know that. You have to use judgment, yet again. How very sad. Never mind. Okay. Let's move on. We have about 10 minutes, well, just under 10 minutes, so we have some time for questions as well. In this same period, in the 1960s, James Meade and Robert Mundell were jointly developing the idea of optimal currency areas. And James Meade, British Nobel Prize winner, wrote in 1961, and this was cited in Mundell's Optimum Currency Area paper that won him the Nobel Prize in 1999. James Meade wrote, "The conditions for a common currency in Western Europe do not exist, and that especially because of the lack of labour mobility, a system of flexible exchange rates will be more effective in promoting balance of payments equilibrium and internal stability." Smart guy, eh? Mundell is inverting. When he's writing his optimal currency, remember what that is. What that says is that if a bunch of economies have synchronized demand shocks, then they may as well have one interest rate across their whole area, because that's going to be better than having lots of different interest rates, because it will be coordinated in the same way as the shocks. And once we think about it, what Mundell is doing is just inverting the Tinbergen-Thiel framework. Tinbergen-Thiel say, if I have output and inflation, I need two instruments. Mundell is saying, well, let's change the metaphor from output and inflation. Let's call it country A and country B. And if country A and country B are so correlated, we can treat them as one country. I only need one instrument to control them. That's the optimal currency area argument. It's the inversion of the Tinbergen-Thiel idea. Rather than having two objectives, if they're highly correlated, those two objectives can be collapsed into one. Gosh, I've just explained that. Did well to get a Nobel Prize for that, didn't he? The point is that highly synchronized economies can form a single monetary union. We'll come on to the extent to which Europe is highly synchronized or not as we continue to watch from the sidelines to our great general entertainment in this country. So what are the caveats to an optimal currency? Well, we know these. This has gone through in the Treasury report that helped produce the foundations for our not joining European Monetary Union. And, have I gone on too far? Yes. One of the failures, I think, of economic science was not to come up with a clear analysis one way or the other if you read the Treasury reports, but that's given. So there are a number of caveats if we try and implement Mundell's ideas. If we estimate shocks and they look synchronized, have we stripped out the ones that monetary policy is able to deal with? We're not quite sure whether the synchronized shocks, let's suppose the synchronized shocks are productivity shocks, then they're not ones that we're thinking monetary policy is about. Monetary policy is about demand shocks, essentially. So if they're not synchronized demand shocks, they're not ones that monetary policy is dealing with. The analysis we were doing in the 90s and the early noughties didn't really deal with that. If there are innate or primitive idiosyncratic shocks, but individual countries have their own fiscal policy, maybe we can't see them. How synchronized is synchronized? Do they have to be 0.9, 0.8, 0.6? Nobody really is able to tell you how synchronized is sufficient for a monetary union. If a bunch of countries in a monetary union have the same interest rate, will they all respond in the same way? Will a given change in interest rates have the same impact on output inflation in country A as country B once they're in a monetary union? If not, the monetary policy shock may itself impart some idiosyncrasy or desynchronized behavior in economies. And shocks, the whole notion of shocks, are really one about randomness. Countries are going to be occasionally rich, occasionally poor, but it's going to dissipate. The idea of shocks that Mundell had in mind was not something that was a chronic payments problem. You're not going to have countries permanently in deficit, permanently with high levels of unemployment. That's not something that monetary policy can deal with. Monetary policy is about short-run trade-offs. But if the monetary union has chronic payments problems, it's not something that can be cured with a monetary policy. So I'll leave those caveats on one side. So monetary policy getting harder and harder as we think about it. In the 60s, 1958, Friedman wrote his program for monetary stability, but it became generally appreciated in the 1960s. And think about this problem for policy as well. Let us suppose the economy has an exogenous, perhaps productivity-driven mean rate of growth and variance of growth, determined by real stuff, productivity, preferences, firm, investment, all those real things that happen in the economy. And that's just a given. So it's primitive and independent of monetary and fiscal policy. Now let's suppose we add in some stabilization policy and make that policy a function of the growth of the economy. What will happen is that the economy now will grow not only according to its primitive exogenous productivity path, but also as a result of the impact of policy that's adding or taking away demand to it all the time. So what you're going to have is two variances, the variance of the exogenous stuff and the variance of policy. And unless policy is sufficiently counter-cyclical, i.e. negatively correlated with the productivity or growth, the variance of the economy will tend to grow if you add policy shocks to it. This is Friedman's insight. And Friedman kind of arguing it's very hard to design counter-cyclical policy, given all the lags in place, that will definitely offset and reduce the volatility of the economy. It seems just as likely to him that policy will add to volatility. And that's certainly what we learnt in the late 60s and early 70s as we entered into the Barber boom, when expenditure added to an economy that was already growing and increased volatility. I think in a world in which policy may not come in stream at the right time, it's just as likely to add to instability than take away from it. This turned out to be very influential to a number of people who started thinking that perhaps discretionary policy of the type that I've described today was more problem than it's worth. 3 more slides. So where does this end up? Well, it ends up with the view that we don't only care about the target, we're going to be caring about the variance or uncertainty around that target as well. We're going to care, it's a buzzword that we hear all the time today from business. The thing they worry about most is uncertainty. And so if we're going to worry as an economy about, let's suppose, inflation variance as much as inflation, could be a world in which we may be willing to accept some miss in inflation, some undershoot in inflation, if it means the variance of inflation is lower than it would otherwise be. And why does the variance of inflation matter? If inflation is highly variable and we're making nominal contracts, our real returns are going to be highly uncertain to us. That's going to be difficult for us to know how many or what quantity of goods and services we can buy if there are uncertain inflation shocks. So William Brainard suggested, well, this is really interesting, because if policy itself induces uncertainty, why might it induce uncertainty? Well, for Friedman-type arguments, we don't know exactly when it's going to come on stream. For other type of arguments, we don't quite know what the policy parameters are. We don't know if we change interest rates by 25 basis points, what the impact on output will be. What's the impact of extra debt? What's the impact of changes in the exchange rate? If we don't know the responses perfectly, then part of the impact is going to be uncertain, and we're injecting some variance into the economy by any given change in policy. So Brainard argues this induces a trade-off not between inflation and output, or output and the exchange rate, but between inflation and its own variance, or any target variable and the variance of that target variable. And as a result of that, if we're trading off attaining a target against its variance, we may be prepared to miss the target a little bit if it reduces the variance compared to trying to hit the target. As a result, we're going to find that policy by, well, certainly by the 90s and the noughties, is becoming gradual and cautious. Even if we're below target or above target, we're not going to try and get back to equilibrium very quickly, because we now think policy itself can impact the economy in a deleterious manner by inducing uncertainty. And hopefully, this will become reasonably clear in the final chart I'm going to thrust upon you this evening. So we have here now a relationship between inflation and inflation variance. If you're not concerned about inflation, just in your own mind replace the word inflation with output and output variance, or unemployment and unemployment variance. I'm not an inflation nutter, but I'm just using a word that we can understand when we think about policy. To point out a trade-off here. This blob here is our inflation target, and for the same concentric circle type reasons, this point here, even though you're hitting the target, is less valuable to you than that point here because there's some positive variance. Similarly, this point here, even though you hit the inflation target, is less valuable to you because the variance is even higher, and analogously all the way out to C and beyond. Of course, this chart doesn't exist on this side because you can't have a negative variance. So we're able to draw worlds in which we're indifferent for the same concentric circle reasons. We're going to be equally worried about high inflation as low inflation, and there's going to be some point here where we hit the target that we're indifferent between missing the target by a little bit here and hitting the target and getting some inflation. So I end up with these form of indifference curves. Okay? Now, let us suppose we're at some point A, 0 inflation and 0 variance. Now, let's think about the trade-off or the constraint the policymaker now has in front of them. Well, The policymaker, by trying to get inflation up again, by cutting interest rates or getting the exchange rate to come down or injecting demand into the economy through fiscal policy, because they're not certain about the impact on the economy, when they try to do something, they inject some variance into the system. So the trade-off the policymaker faces is along this line ABC. As they try to move the economy back to its target, because they inject some variance in the system, the economy gets more uncertain. Now, we should be able to see that this slope is indeed a measure of the efficacy of policy. If a policy worked perfectly, it would be a vertical line. We could get back to equilibrium without injecting any variance, and then we'd have a very good instrument at our disposal. The less good the instrument is, the flatter this line is going to be. Because for every unit we get back to target, we inject even more variance into our economy. So this is the feasibility path for the policymaker. And now we can begin to understand why it looks like policymakers are sitting on their hands. We don't quite know what's going to happen in our economy if we try to get inflation up again, if we try to get the economy going. We are going to inject more and more variance into our economy. So what we're going to try and do is get to the best indifference curve that we can, the one nearest. Just think of it as the point that's nearest our bliss point. And for this particular feasibility set, the nearest point is B. And so rather than going all the way back to C, I'm going to prefer B. Because I'd rather miss by this much and have less variance in my economy than trying to get all the way back and increase the variance in my economy. Because the policymaker is injecting uncertainty in the economy, they're prepared to miss their target by a little. They act cautiously. They do less than it appears and are prepared to have an undershoot in inflation rather than get the economy back to equilibrium. So it's a story of self-constrained behavior. We thought when the golden fetters were removed, policymakers would be able to do whatever they wanted to, whenever they wanted to. But it turned out they had to respect uncertainty, and in the respect of uncertainty, they found that there was a limit to both what they could do, and what they should do, and what they would be able to claim to do. And so we're going to end up with a world in which policy has to be used sparingly, and perhaps a better appreciation of why the gold standard as a rule was not so bad. Thank you very much.